This historical account examines the Ottoman Empire's strategic conquest of Sofia in 1385. This pivotal military campaign secured Sultan Murad I's control over one of the most important cities in the Central Balkans, which established Turkish dominance over crucial trade routes and military corridors connecting Constantinople with Central Europe and linking Thrace with the Danube basin. We'll explore how Sofia's geographic position at the crossroads of major Balkan routes made it a prize whose capture would fundamentally enhance Ottoman strategic capabilities, how the city's defenses under Bulgarian and local governance proved inadequate against the sophisticated siege warfare techniques that Ottoman forces had perfected through decades of conquest, how the city's diverse population of Bulgarians, Greeks, and other communities adapted to the transition from Christian to Muslim political authority, and how Sofia's transformation into a major Ottoman administrative and military center would shape the city's development for the next 5 centuries. Through 7 detailed parts, we'll witness the military operations that captured the city, the diplomatic and administrative integration that followed conquest, the economic and cultural transformations that Ottoman rule initiated, and the long-term consequences of Sofia's incorporation into the expanding Ottoman Empire that would make it one of the most important Turkish provincial centers in the Balkans. 1385's winter brought Sultan Murad I's attention to the strategic Bulgarian city of Sofia. Nestled in a fertile valley at the western foot of the Vitosha mountain, where ancient Roman roads converged to connect Constantinople with Belgrade and the Danube frontier, where routes from the Adriatic coast met pathways leading north toward Hungary and south toward Thessaloniki, creating a geographic crossroads whose control would provide whoever possessed the city with unparalleled ability to project military power throughout the Central Balkans, while also dominating the commercial networks that channeled trade between diverse regions and that generated wealth through customs revenues and merchant activities that prosperous crossroads cities invariably attracted. Sofia's importance transcended its substantial population of perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 inhabitants, or its impressive fortifications inherited from Roman and Byzantine builders who had recognized the site's strategic value across centuries of imperial competition, encompassing the city's role as administrative center for surrounding territories, as market hub where agricultural products from fertile valleys met manufactured goods from urban workshops and imported luxuries from distant lands, and as cultural nexus where Bulgarian, Greek, and other Balkan populations mingled to create the cosmopolitan urban society that characterized major medieval cities, serving as bridges between different regions and peoples. Sultan Murad, having spent nearly 2 decades systematically expanding Ottoman control throughout Thrace, Macedonia, and the southern Balkans through a combination of military conquest and diplomatic pressure that brought most Bulgarian and Serbian territories under Turkish suzerainty or direct administration, recognized that Sofia's capture would represent a crucial step toward consolidating Ottoman dominance over the entire Balkan interior, and would provide the strategic position necessary for future campaigns targeting Hungarian territories to the north and Bosnian lands to the west that remained beyond Ottoman control, despite the impressive Turkish expansion that had already transformed Southeastern Europe's political landscape. The historical context surrounding Sofia's situation in 1385 reflected the progressive disintegration of Bulgarian political authority that had characterized the decades since the Bulgarian Empire's fragmentation following the death of Tsar Ivan Alexander in 1371, with the kingdom dividing into competing principalities based in Tarnovo under Ivan Shishman and in Vidin under Ivan Senior Atsamir, whose mutual rivalries prevented effective coordination against Ottoman expansion that exploited Bulgarian divisions through diplomatic pressure applied separately to each ruler and through military operations that progressively reduced independent Bulgarian territory. Sofia itself occupied ambiguous political position in the early 1380s, with the city nominally under Bulgarian authority but practically vulnerable to Ottoman pressure given its geographic proximity to Turkish-controlled territories in Thrace and Macedonia, and given the progressive weakening of Bulgarian military capabilities following the catastrophic Serbian defeat at the Battle of Maritsa in 1371 that had also involved substantial Bulgarian contingents and that had demonstrated the futility of Balkan Christian military resistance to Ottoman forces whose tactical sophistication and organizational capabilities exceeded what fragmented Christian states could match. The city's Bulgarian rulers and population confronted the harsh reality that their independence depended not on their own military capability to resist Ottoman conquest, but rather on Sultan Murad's strategic calculations about when Sofia's capture would best serve Turkish interests, and about whether diplomatic pressure might achieve desired outcomes without requiring costly siege operations. The fortifications that protected Sofia reflected centuries of military architecture as successive rulers had strengthened and expanded defensive works originally constructed during Roman times when the city served as important garrison town on imperial frontiers, with walls encircling the urban core and towers positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire against attackers, while gates controlled access to the city and channeled potential invaders into killing zones where defenders could concentrate their forces. The defensive infrastructure, though impressive by medieval Balkan standards, nonetheless suffered from the reality that 14th century siege warfare techniques, including sophisticated mining operations, powerful bombardment equipment, and systematic approaches to reducing fortifications, had evolved to overcome static defenses that could not be continuously updated to match offensive capabilities. The Sofia garrison and local militia that would be responsible for defending the city against Ottoman attack numbered perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 armed men, including professional soldiers maintained by Bulgarian authorities, urban militia drawn from the merchant and artisan populations, and various irregular forces whose loyalty and effectiveness varied considerably depending on circumstances and leadership, creating defensive force adequate for deterring raids or resisting minor threats, but grossly inadequate for sustaining prolonged defense against determined Ottoman siege, employing the full capabilities of Turkish military establishment. The economic significance of Sofia's position at the intersection of major Balkan trade routes meant that the city's commercial activities generated substantial wealth that would make it an attractive target for Ottoman conquest, both for immediate plunder that a successful siege might provide and for long-term tax revenues that incorporation into Ottoman administrative systems would generate. The markets that operated in Sofia's commercial districts handled agricultural products from surrounding villages, manufactured goods produced by urban artisans specializing in metalwork, textiles, leather goods, and various other crafts, and imported luxuries including spices, fine fabrics, and exotic goods that merchants brought from distant lands to sell to Sofia's relatively wealthy urban population. The customs revenues that Bulgarian authorities collected from this commercial activity provided significant funding for local governance and military forces, while the economic prosperity that trade generated created urban middle class of merchants and craftsmen whose material interests in stability and security would influence how Sofia's population would respond to Ottoman conquest and to the choice between resistance that would disrupt commerce and economic life versus accommodation that might preserve economic activities under new political authority. The religious and cultural landscape of Sofia in the early 1380s demonstrated the ethnic and confessional diversity that characterized major Balkan urban centers, with Bulgarian Orthodox Christians constituting probably the majority population, but with significant Greek, Armenian, and Jewish communities, whose presence reflected Sofia's role as commercial crossroads attracting diverse populations seeking economic opportunities, and whose varying relationships with Bulgarian political authorities and with each other created complex urban society whose loyalties and interests could not be reduced to simple nationalist or religious categories. The Bulgarian Orthodox churches and monasteries that dominated Sofia's religious landscape served both spiritual and social functions, providing worship spaces while also serving as educational institutions, charitable organizations, and repositories of cultural memory that preserved the Bulgarian language and traditions, despite political upheavals that periodically altered who governed the city. The Greek commercial community, though numerically smaller than the Bulgarian population, wielded disproportionate economic influence through mercantile networks connecting Sofia to Constantinople and to other major trading cities, creating economic interdependencies that transcended ethnic divisions while also sometimes generating tensions between Greek merchants and Bulgarian artisans or between different communities competing for resources and influence. The intelligence gathering that Ottoman authorities conducted regarding Sofia's defenses, garrison strength, population loyalties, and political situation provided Sultan Murad with detailed information necessary for planning effective conquest operations, while also identifying potential internal divisions or sympathetic elements that might facilitate Ottoman entry into the city through diplomatic means or through internal betrayals that could avoid costly siege warfare. The Ottoman reconnaissance efforts combined traditional military scouting that observed Sofia's fortifications and defensive preparations with more sophisticated intelligence operations, including recruitment of informants among Sofia's population who might provide information about internal conditions in exchange for financial rewards or promises of favorable treatment under Ottoman rule. Infiltration of commercial networks where Ottoman merchants or agents could gather intelligence while conducting business, and exploitation of refugees or travelers from Sofia who could be interrogated about city's defensive capabilities and about political attitudes among garrison and population. The comprehensive intelligence picture that these various sources provided gave Sultan Murad significant advantages in planning conquest operations, while also enabling Ottoman diplomatic efforts to identify and exploit divisions within Sofia's leadership and population that might facilitate the city's capture through means less costly than extended siege warfare. The diplomatic initiatives that Ottoman representatives conducted with Sofia's Bulgarian authorities during 1384 and early 1385 before military operations commenced reflected Sultan Murad's preference for achieving strategic objectives through negotiated settlements when possible rather than through military force that inevitably involved casualties and costs. Even when victory appeared certain, the Ottoman proposals offered Sofia's rulers options, including acceptance of vassal status that would preserve local governance under Turkish suzerainty in exchange for tribute and military support obligations, or peaceful surrender that would guarantee protection for the population and preservation of religious institutions in exchange for accepting direct Ottoman administration. The Bulgarian responses to these Ottoman overtures revealed divisions among Sofia's leadership between those who favored accommodation as preferable to military resistance that appeared hopeless and those who insisted on defending Bulgarian independence regardless of military odds or costs, with these internal debates consuming valuable time during which Ottoman military preparations for siege operations continued and during which the window for negotiating favorable terms progressively narrowed as Sultan Murad's patience for diplomatic solutions diminished. 1385's early spring witnessed the commencement of Ottoman military operations targeting Sofia as Sultan Murad, having concluded that diplomatic pressure would not achieve Sofia's submission without military demonstration of Turkish power and having completed the logistical preparations necessary for conducting effective siege operations, ordered the concentration of Ottoman forces in Macedonia and southern Bulgarian territories for a campaign that would add this strategically crucial city to the expanding roster of Balkan urban centers under Turkish control. The Ottoman army that assembled for the Sofia campaign represented a substantial military force numbering perhaps 15,000 to 25,000 warriors, including the elite Janissary infantry, whose discipline and training made them exceptionally effective in both siege warfare and open battle. Turkish cavalry, whose mobility enabled them to range across surrounding countryside, securing the operational area and preventing enemy reinforcements or supplies from reaching the besieged city, and various auxiliary forces, including contingents provided by Christian vassals whose participation demonstrated their subordination to Ottoman authority, while also providing additional military manpower that augmented Turkish forces. The siege train accompanying this army included the technical equipment and specialized personnel necessary for conducting systematic siege operations, including trebuchets and catapults for bombardment, mining equipment for undermining fortifications, siege towers, and scaling ladders for assault operations, and the vast quantities of supplies necessary for sustaining large military forces in the field for the weeks or months that effective siege of well-fortified city might require. The march route that Ottoman forces followed from their assembly areas in Macedonia toward Sofia took them through territories that had already come under Turkish control or vassalage, enabling relatively secure movement through friendly or neutral territory until approaching Sofia itself, where Bulgarian forces might attempt to contest Ottoman advance or to defend strategic positions that could delay Turkish arrival at the city. The logistical challenges of moving such a substantial military force with its accompanying siege equipment, supply trains, and support personnel across distances of several hundred miles required sophisticated organizational capabilities that Ottoman military administration had developed through decades of continuous campaigning, with advance parties securing routes and arranging supplies, with main forces moving in organized formations that maintained security while covering ground efficiently, and with rear echelons ensuring that supply lines remained open and that reinforcements and additional supplies could reach the army as campaign progressed. The march itself demonstrated Ottoman military professionalism and organizational sophistication that distinguished Turkish forces from the more improvised military operations that characterized many medieval armies whose logistical limitations often constrained their operational effectiveness as much as enemy action. The Bulgarian military response to the Ottoman advance toward Sofia revealed the fundamental weakness of the fragmented Bulgarian political structure that prevented effective coordination of defensive efforts even when facing an existential threat to one of Bulgaria's most important cities. Tsar Ivan Shishman, nominally the ruler whose authority encompassed Sofia's territory, possessed neither the military resources nor the political unity necessary to organize a serious relief expedition that might challenge Ottoman forces besieging the city or that might force Sultan Murad to divide his forces between maintaining the siege and defending against a Bulgarian counterattack. The other Bulgarian ruler, Ivan Siratsumir, governing western Bulgarian territories from Bidin, maintained an ambiguous position toward Sofia's crisis, theoretically sharing interest in preventing Ottoman conquest of Bulgarian territories but practically prioritizing his own principality's security and avoiding provocative actions that might draw Ottoman military attention toward his own domains. This Bulgarian disunity, reflecting decades of political fragmentation and mutual rivalries that Ottoman diplomatic pressure had deliberately cultivated and exploited, meant that Sofia would face Ottoman siege essentially alone, without a realistic prospect of external military assistance that might have altered the strategic balance or that might have enabled more effective resistance to Turkish conquest. The Ottoman encirclement of Sofia that commenced in late March or early April 1385 followed established siege warfare procedures that Ottoman forces had refined through numerous previous operations, with Turkish forces establishing camps at strategic positions around the city's perimeter to prevent garrison sorties or civilian evacuations, while also constructing the earthworks, palisades, and fortified positions necessary for protecting besieging forces against Bulgarian counterattacks and for providing platforms from which siege operations could be conducted. The encirclement process itself required several days as Ottoman engineers surveyed approaches to Sofia's fortifications, identified optimal positions for siege equipment, and began constructing the infrastructure necessary for sustained siege operations, including supply depots, command posts, medical facilities, and the various other installations that large military forces operating in the field required for maintaining effectiveness over extended periods. According to historical analysis presented in the Ottoman Conquest of the Balkans by Machilkil, this systematic approach to siege warfare reflected Ottoman military sophistication that combined technical expertise with organizational capabilities, enabling Turkish forces to conduct complex operations requiring coordination of diverse elements over extended time periods, demonstrating why Ottoman sieges typically succeeded even against well-fortified positions that might have resisted less capable besieging forces. The initial Ottoman bombardment of Sofia's fortifications commenced once siege positions had been established and artillery equipment positioned, with trebuchets and catapults launching projectiles against the city's walls, towers, and gates in systematic effort to create breaches suitable for assault, while also inflicting psychological pressure on defenders and civilian population who would experience constant danger from bombardment and from the structural damage that accumulated impacts inflicted on defensive works and on buildings within the city. The Ottoman bombardment operated continuously when weather and technical factors permitted, creating relentless pressure that allowed Sofia's defenders no respite, and that progressively weakened fortifications through cumulative damage that individual projectile impacts achieved. The noise and destruction that bombardment created, combined with the casualties inflicted when projectiles struck defenders, or when damaged structures collapsed on soldiers and civilians, created psychological as well as physical impacts that undermined defender morale and that raised questions among Sofia's population about whether prolonged resistance served any achievable purpose or whether accommodation with Ottoman demands might better serve the city's interests. The mining operations that Ottoman engineers initiated beneath Sofia's walls represented a parallel siege technique designed to breach fortifications through tunneling beneath walls and towers, then collapsing the excavations to bring down structures above, creating gaps in the defensive perimeter through which assault forces could penetrate. The Ottoman mining efforts required extraordinary labor as Turkish miners excavated tunnels through difficult soil and rock, shored up their passages with timber supports, and worked in conditions of extreme danger where tunnel collapse could entomb workers, or where Bulgarian countermining efforts might intercept Ottoman excavations, creating deadly underground combat. The Bulgarian defenders, aware that Ottoman mining posed potentially greater threat than surface bombardment, conducted their own countermining operations, attempting to detect and intercept Turkish tunnels before they could achieve their objectives, creating an underground dimension to the siege that remained invisible to surface observers, but that could prove decisive in determining whether Ottoman forces could breach fortifications that had resisted direct assault. The diplomatic communications between Ottoman siege commanders and Sofia's Bulgarian authorities continued even as military operations intensified, with Turkish envoys offering progressively less favorable terms for surrender as the siege advanced and as Ottoman investment of time or resources and casualties in the operation increased. The initial Ottoman offers that had promised preservation of Bulgarian governance under vassal arrangements gave way to proposals for peaceful surrender that would guarantee population protection, but that would establish direct Ottoman administration. demonstrating the deteriorating bargaining position that Sofia's rulers faced as the siege progressed and as realistic prospects for successful defense or for external relief diminished. The Bulgarian responses to these Ottoman overtures revealed increasing desperation as defenders recognized that their military situation was progressively worsening and that continued resistance would result only in eventual defeat under circumstances that would be more catastrophic than terms that immediate surrender might secure. Yet the political and psychological difficulties of accepting defeat when fortifications remained intact and when garrison retained combat capability prevented immediate capitulation despite the rational strategic arguments favoring accommodation. 1385 spring months witnessed the progressive tightening of Ottoman siege operations as Sultan Murad's forces, having established complete encirclement of Sofia and having initiated systematic efforts to breach the city's fortifications through bombardment and mining, intensified military pressure designed to create conditions where Bulgarian defenders would recognize the futility of continued resistance and would accept Ottoman terms before costly assault operations became necessary. The daily routine of siege warfare settled into grim pattern, where Ottoman bombardment continued with mechanical regularity, where mining operations beneath the walls advanced incrementally despite Bulgarian countermining efforts, where occasional Bulgarian sorties attempted to disrupt Ottoman siege works but typically achieved only limited tactical success before being driven back by superior Turkish forces, and where the civilian population experienced progressive deterioration of living conditions as food supplies consumed faster than rationing could preserve them, as water sources came under threat from Ottoman operations, and as the constant stress of siege created psychological exhaustion that affected defenders' capability and will to maintain resistance. The human cost of the siege accumulated through combat casualties inflicted during bombardments and skirmishes, through disease that inevitably emerged when large populations lived in confined spaces with inadequate sanitation, and through the hunger and deprivation that progressive resource depletion created for Sofia's civilian population, whose suffering provided pressure on Bulgarian authorities to accept surrender terms that would end the siege before conditions deteriorated to the point of catastrophe. The breakthrough that Ottoman mining operations achieved during late spring created the decisive tactical opportunity that Turkish commanders had been systematically working to produce, as successful tunnel excavation beneath a crucial section of Sofia's defensive walls enabled Ottoman engineers to collapse the undermining, bringing down substantial portion of fortifications and creating a breach through which assault forces could potentially penetrate into the city, despite the rubble and defensive positions that Bulgarian forces would quickly establish to contain the penetration. The moment when the wall section collapsed, accompanied by tremendous noise and dust clouds that momentarily obscured the battlefield, represented the culmination of weeks of dangerous underground labor and the vindication of siege warfare techniques that Ottoman forces had perfected through numerous previous operations. Yet the breach's creation did not automatically translate into Ottoman victory, as Sofia's defenders rushed the compromised section, establishing hasty defensive positions among the rubble and preparing to contest any Turkish assault attempts with desperate determination born from recognition that once Ottoman forces penetrated the walls, the city's fall would become inevitable, and that only determined defense of the breach might preserve any possibility of continued resistance. The Ottoman assault through the created breach commenced after Turkish commanders had assessed the tactical situation and had positioned assault forces for maximum effectiveness, with Janissary infantry leading the attack, supported by other Ottoman units positioned to exploit any breakthrough and to expand penetration into the city's interior once initial resistance at the breach had been overcome. The fighting at the breach proved extraordinarily intense as Bulgarian defenders recognized that preventing Ottoman penetration represented their last realistic chance to preserve Sofia's independence, fighting with the desperation of men who understood that defeat would mean not merely personal death, but the end of their city's freedom and the subjugation of their families and communities to foreign Muslim rule. The Ottoman assault forces, though possessing numerical superiority and organizational advantages, nonetheless paid substantial price in casualties as they attempted to force their way through the breach against determined Bulgarian resistance that inflicted losses despite being ultimately unable to prevent Ottoman penetration given the Turkish advantages in numbers, equipment, and tactical position that made the breach fundamentally indefensible once sufficient Ottoman forces could be concentrated at the critical point. The penetration of Ottoman forces into Sofia's interior through the breached fortifications transformed the siege from external pressure against defensive perimeter into urban combat within the city itself. creating conditions where Bulgarian defenders attempted to establish successive defensive lines at streets and squares that might delay Ottoman advance while civilian population faced the terrifying reality of warfare spreading throughout their city with all the attendant dangers of violence, fire, and the breakdown of order that urban combat typically produced. The Ottoman forces advancing into Sofia maintained remarkable discipline despite the chaos and opportunities for indisciplined plunder that urban combat created, with Turkish commanders enforcing orders to minimize unnecessary destruction and to protect civilians who did not resist. Recognizing that Sultan Murad's broader strategic interests required transforming Sofia into a productive Ottoman provincial center rather than reducing it to devastated ruin through uncontrolled sack. This Ottoman restraint, though not absolute, and though individual violations certainly occurred, nonetheless distinguished the Turkish conquest of Sofia from the harsher sacks that often characterized medieval urban warfare, where victorious attackers subjected defeated cities to days of uncontrolled violence and plunder that destroyed economic value, and that created lasting resentments, complicating subsequent governance. The Bulgarian decision to surrender Sofia before the complete Ottoman conquest of the entire city reflected pragmatic recognition by remaining Bulgarian authorities that continued resistance would result only in additional casualties and destruction without altering the ultimate outcome, and that accepting Ottoman terms while the city remained partly intact might secure better conditions than those that would be available after complete Turkish military victory. The surrender negotiations occurred even as fighting continued in various parts of the city, with Bulgarian representatives seeking Ottoman guarantees for population protection and for preservation of churches and religious institutions, while Ottoman negotiators, operating under Sultan Murad's general guidelines emphasizing that conquered populations should be treated with sufficient generosity to encourage future submissions, agreed to terms that provided reassurance to Sofia's frightened population while also establishing Ottoman authority and securing Turkish strategic objectives. The formal surrender ceremony that marked Sofia's submission to Ottoman rule occurred within days of the wall breach, involving Bulgarian authorities formally acknowledging Sultan Murad's sovereignty, Ottoman forces taking control of key positions throughout the city, and the beginning of transition from Bulgarian Christian to Ottoman Muslim political authority that would reshape Sofia's governance, economy, and cultural landscape over subsequent months and years. The immediate aftermath of Sofia's conquest saw Ottoman military authorities establishing order throughout the city, preventing the indisciplined pillage that defeated populations typically feared, securing food supplies and essential services that would enable the civilian population to survive the transition period, and beginning the administrative processes necessary for integrating Sofia into Ottoman provincial governance structures. Sultan Murad's representatives entered the city to conduct formal ceremonies acknowledging Turkish sovereignty, to receive submissions from Bulgarian officials and community leaders, and to announce the Sultan's policies regarding religious tolerance, property rights, and governance arrangements that would apply to Sofia under Ottoman administration. The mixture of relief among Sofia's population that the siege was over and that they had survived the conquest relatively intact, combined with anxiety about what Ottoman rule would mean for their daily lives, their religious practices, and their economic circumstances, creating complex psychological atmosphere where gratitude for survival mixed with grief over loss of independence and uncertainty about the future under foreign Muslim governance. The casualties that the siege inflicted on both Ottoman attackers and Bulgarian defenders, though difficult to establish precisely from fragmentary historical sources, clearly represented substantial losses on both sides that reflected the serious combat that occurred despite the relatively brief duration of active siege operations once Ottoman forces had established encirclement. The Ottoman forces probably suffered several hundred to perhaps 1,000 more casualties, including deaths, serious wounds, and disease, with most losses occurring during the assault through the breached walls when Bulgarian defenders fought most desperately. The Bulgarian defenders and civilian population suffered comparable or greater losses, including garrison casualties from bombardment, mining-related deaths, combat during the final assault, and civilian deaths from siege hardships, including disease, hunger, and violence, creating a tragic toll that represented the real human cost of conquest that broader strategic narratives sometimes minimize in favor of political and military analysis. The widows, orphans, and families who lost members during the siege experienced personal catastrophes that would affect their lives permanently, demonstrating that historical events that appear as brief episodes in grand narratives nonetheless created profound individual tragedies for countless people whose personal stories have been largely lost to historical record. 1385 through 1387 witnessed Sofia's systematic transformation from conquered Bulgarian city into established Ottoman provincial center as Sultan Murad's administrators implemented policies designed to integrate the city into Turkish governance structures, to establish military presence ensuring Ottoman security, to revitalize economic activity that conquest and siege had disrupted, and to create conditions enabling coexistence between the predominantly Christian Bulgarian population and the growing Muslim Turkish community that Ottoman settlement policies encouraged. The administrative reorganization that Ottoman authorities conducted during Sofia's initial years under Turkish rule established governance structures combining elements of Islamic administrative traditions with adaptations, recognizing the predominantly Christian character of Sofia's population, creating hybrid systems that enabled Ottoman officials to govern effectively while also permitting Bulgarian communities to maintain internal affairs autonomy that reduced resistance and that enabled smoother transition than rigid imposition of purely Islamic governance models might have produced. The appointment of Ottoman provincial governor with authority over Sofia and surrounding territories, supported by administrative staff including tax collectors, judicial officials, military commanders, and various other functionaries necessary for governing substantial urban center, created visible Ottoman presence that demonstrated Turkish sovereignty, while also providing governance mechanisms capable of managing complex urban society whose diverse populations required sophisticated administration rather than simple military occupation. The military garrison that Ottoman authorities established in Sofia served multiple strategic purposes, including ensuring internal security by deterring or suppressing any potential resistance from Bulgarian population, providing forces for defending the city against external threats that might emerge from territories not yet under complete Ottoman control, and creating base for future military operations targeting Hungarian or Bosnian territories that remain beyond Turkish dominance, despite impressive Ottoman expansion throughout most of the Balkans. The garrison forces, probably numbering several thousand warriors including Janissary units, cavalry contingents, and various support personnel, occupied strategic positions throughout Sofia, including the citadel and key fortification points that Ottoman engineers strengthened and adapted to Turkish military requirements. The permanent military presence created both security for Ottoman administration and economic impact for Sofia's economy, as garrison personnel required food, supplies, equipment, and services that local populations could provide through commercial transactions that created employment and income opportunities, even as military occupation represented a visible reminder of foreign domination. The settlement policies that Ottoman authorities implemented to encourage Turkish Muslim migration to Sofia reflected a broader Ottoman strategy of creating loyal Muslim populations in strategically important conquered territories, providing demographic support for Turkish rule while also developing agricultural production and commercial activities that would generate tax revenues and that would contribute to regional prosperity. Under Ottoman governance, the incentives offered to Turkish settlers included land grants from properties confiscated from Bulgarian owners who had fled during conquest or who were deemed hostile to Ottoman rule, tax exemptions or reduced rates during initial settlement periods, and various privileges designed to make migration attractive to Anatolian peasants seeking economic opportunities and to Turkish warriors being settled after completing military service. The Turkish neighborhoods that emerged in Sofia during the late 1380s, typically concentrated in areas near the garrison and administrative center, created a visible Muslim presence that transformed Sofia's ethnic and religious composition while also creating potential sources of tension with existing Bulgarian Christian communities who viewed Turkish settlement as a threat to their own position and as a manifestation of foreign domination. The economic policies that Ottoman authorities implemented in Sofia combined elements designed to generate tax revenues for the Ottoman treasury with measures intended to revitalize commercial and artisan activities that siege and conquest had disrupted, recognizing that prosperous Sofia would provide greater long-term value than an impoverished city whose economic productivity had been destroyed by conquest and exploitation. The tax assessment process conducted by Ottoman officials in 1386 systematically evaluated Sofia's population, property, and economic activities to establish a basis for taxation substantial enough to serve Ottoman fiscal interests, while remaining sustainable at levels that would not drive populations into poverty or rebellion. To commercial regulations that the Ottoman administration imposed, standardized weights, measures, and commercial practices according to patterns employed throughout Ottoman territories, facilitating integration into broader Turkish economic networks while also creating the certainty that merchants needed for conducting business. The infrastructure investments that Ottoman authorities directed toward repairing siege damage, strengthening fortifications, constructing new buildings for administration and commerce, and improving roads connecting Sofia to other Ottoman centers demonstrated Turkish commitment to developing the city rather than merely exploiting it for immediate resource extraction. The religious policies that Ottoman authorities implemented towards Sofia's predominantly Christian Orthodox population followed established Islamic legal frameworks governing protected religious minorities, while also reflecting pragmatic recognition that excessive religious oppression would generate resistance, requiring costly suppression efforts that would undermine the benefits that Sofia's conquest was intended to provide. The guarantees protecting Christian religious practices, preserving church properties, and permitting internal church governance autonomy created a framework where Bulgarian Orthodox communities could maintain their faith and cultural traditions despite living under Muslim political authority, reducing potential sources of resistance while also fulfilling Islamic legal obligations regarding treatment of dhimmi populations. The restrictions that Ottoman regulations imposed on Christian religious activities, including prohibitions on new church construction, requirements that churches not be taller or more prominent than mosques, and limitations on public Christian religious displays, nonetheless created ongoing reminders of subordinate status that Christian populations experienced under Muslim rule. The construction of mosques in Sofia, beginning shortly after Ottoman conquest and accelerating during subsequent years, created a visible Islamic presence that transformed the city's religious landscape while serving both the spiritual needs of the growing Muslim population and symbolic purposes, demonstrating Ottoman sovereignty and the Islamic character of Turkish rule. The social dynamics that emerged in Sofia during the initial years of Ottoman rule reflected complex interactions between Bulgarian Christian populations attempting to adapt to Turkish governance, while preserving their identity and traditions. Turkish Muslim settlers establishing communities and building institutions in their new home, and Ottoman administrators attempting to govern diverse populations whose potential antagonisms required careful management to prevent conflicts that might undermine stability. The residential patterns that developed during this period showed progressive spatial separation between Bulgarian Christian quarters, Turkish Muslim neighborhoods, and areas where Greek merchants, Armenian craftsmen, and other minority communities established their own districts, creating an urban geography where different populations lived in relative proximity, while maintaining substantial social distance and institutional separateness. The commercial interactions between members of different communities, occurring in markets where Bulgarian artisans, Turkish merchants, Greek traders, and various others conducted business transactions despite religious and ethnic differences, created spaces where practical necessities of economic exchange generated functional cooperation even when social and cultural divides remained substantial. The conflicts and tensions that periodically erupted, including disputes over property rights, commercial competition, religious practices, and various other sources of friction inherent in diverse urban societies under conditions of conquest and foreign rule, required Ottoman authorities to exercise judicial and administrative skills in managing intercommunal relations while maintaining order necessary for effective governance. The cultural production in Sofia during the early Ottoman period reflected the traumatic impact of conquest on Bulgarian society, while also demonstrating the resilience of cultural traditions that could survive despite political subordination. With Bulgarian literary and artistic activities continuing in monasteries and churches that preserved the Bulgarian language and Orthodox traditions even as Ottoman, Turkish, and Islamic culture became increasingly prominent in public spaces. The Serbian and Bulgarian chronicles that recorded Sofia's conquest portrayed the event as a catastrophe and as a manifestation of divine punishment for Christian sins, creating narratives that emphasize suffering while also providing religious frameworks for understanding misfortune that made tragedy bearable by suggesting that faithful endurance might eventually lead to deliverance. The folk songs and oral traditions that emerged from Sofia's conquest and that would be transmitted across generations before being recorded in later centuries created cultural memories that preserved Bulgarian identity and that sustained hopes for eventual liberation despite the immediate reality of Ottoman domination that appeared permanent and overwhelming. 1388 through 1390 witnessed the full manifestation of how Sofia's capture had fundamentally enhanced Ottoman strategic position in the Central Balkans, enabling military operations and administrative control throughout regions that had previously been difficult to access from Ottoman bases in Thrace and Macedonia, and that now could be effectively governed and defended through operations coordinated from Sofia's central position. The military campaigns that Ottoman forces launched from Sofia as their base of operations during these years targeted remaining pockets of Bulgarian resistance in western territories, probed northward toward Hungarian frontier, establishing Ottoman presence in regions that would later become zones of sustained Ottoman-Hungarian military competition, and projected Turkish power into Bosnia and Serbia in ways that demonstrated how Sofia's conquest had expanded Ottoman operational reach throughout the Balkans. the garrison forces permanently stationed in Sofia, supplemented by additional troops that can be rapidly concentrated at the city when major campaigns required substantial military forces, created military infrastructure that made Sofia one of the most important Ottoman military centers in European territories, alongside Edirne and other key bases from which Turkish expansion and consolidation operations were coordinated. The administrative infrastructure that Ottoman authorities developed in Sofia established the city as the provincial capital governing extensive territories in the Central and Western Balkans, with the bureaucratic apparatus managing tax collection, judicial proceedings, military recruitment, and various other governance functions across regions where Ottoman authority now prevailed. The appointment of increasingly senior Ottoman officials to govern Sofia and its province reflected the city's growing importance within the imperial hierarchy, with governors who held titles conferring substantial authority and who reported directly to the Sultan's court rather than through intermediate administrative layers, demonstrating Sofia's status as a major provincial center rather than as merely a secondary administrative unit. The records that Ottoman administration maintained, documenting tax assessments, judicial decisions, military deployments, and countless other aspects of governance, created documentation that enabled systematic management of complex territories while also providing historical sources that modern scholars have used to reconstruct social, economic, and political conditions during Ottoman rule. Despite the fragmentary survival of these records across subsequent centuries of warfare, administrative reorganization, and general entropy affecting medieval documents, the commercial development that Sofia experienced under Ottoman governance, benefiting from security that Turkish military power provided and from integration into empire-wide commercial networks, created prosperity that made the city one of the most economically important Ottoman provincial centers, and that generated substantial tax revenues enriching the imperial treasury while also creating wealth that benefited local populations including both Muslim and Christian merchants, artisans, and property owners. The trade routes passing through Sofia, now secured by Ottoman military presence and regulated by Turkish commercial administration, carried increasing volumes of goods connecting Constantinople with Central European markets, linking Black Sea ports with the Adriatic coast, and channeling various other commercial flows whose protection and regulation through Sofia generated customs revenues and commercial activities that sustained urban prosperity. The manufacturing activities that developed in Sofia, taking advantage of local resources including agricultural products from surrounding valleys and skilled labor from diverse urban populations, produced textiles, metalwork, leather goods, and various other manufactures that serve both local consumption and export markets, creating employment and wealth that made Sofia an attractive destination for migrants seeking economic opportunities, whether they came from rural Balkan regions or from distant parts of the Ottoman Empire. The demographic transformation that Ottoman rule accelerated in Sofia over time progressively altered the city's ethnic and religious composition as Turkish Muslim settlement continued, as some Bulgarian Christians converted to Islam to access opportunities and privileges available to Muslims, and as economic prosperity attracted diverse populations, including Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and others whose presence created an increasingly cosmopolitan urban society. The Turkish Muslim population that grew through immigration and natural increase gradually approached and eventually exceeded the Bulgarian Christian population in numerical terms, though the pace and exact timing of when Muslims became the majority remains subject to historical debate, given fragmentary and sometimes contradictory census data from this period. The conversions to Islam that occurred among some Bulgarian Christians reflected complex motivations including genuine religious conviction, desire for social mobility and economic opportunities that Muslim status provided, pressure from Ottoman authorities who sometimes used financial incentives or various forms of coercion to encourage conversion, and in some cases probably calculation that embracing Islam would provide protection for families and properties under circumstances where Christian status involved vulnerabilities and disadvantages. The persistence of substantial Christian populations in Sofia despite conversions and despite Turkish immigration demonstrated that Ottoman religious policies, while clearly privileging Muslims and creating incentives for conversion, nonetheless permitted Christian communities to survive and, in some cases, to prosper under Turkish rule, creating a multi-religious urban society that would characterize Sofia throughout the Ottoman period. The architectural transformation of Sofia under Ottoman rule progressively altered the city's physical appearance as Turkish authorities and wealthy individuals commissioned the construction of mosques, baths, markets, caravanserais, and various other buildings following Ottoman architectural styles that introduced Islamic design elements, including domes, minarets, and geometric decorative patterns that became increasingly prominent features of Sofia's urban landscape. The major mosques constructed in Sofia during the late 14th and 15th centuries served both religious functions, providing worship spaces for the growing Muslim population, and symbolic purposes demonstrating Islamic presence and Ottoman sovereignty in the city that had been a Christian Bulgarian center, creating visible manifestations of political and religious transformation that Conquest had initiated. The public baths that Ottoman authorities constructed following Turkish traditions of communal bathing and serving both hygienic and social functions provided facilities that benefited all urban residents regardless of religion, while also introducing Ottoman cultural practices into daily life. The covered markets and commercial buildings that Ottoman investment produced created infrastructure supporting commercial activities, while also reflecting Turkish architectural aesthetics that transformed Sofia's physical environment in ways that made Ottoman presence impossible to ignore, even for those who might have preferred to maintain exclusively a Bulgarian Christian cultural landscape. The educational and cultural institutions that developed in Ottoman Sofia served the diverse communities that inhabited the city, with Islamic schools attached to mosques providing religious education and training future administrators and religious scholars, Christian schools connected to churches maintaining Bulgarian language instruction and Orthodox religious teaching, and various informal educational arrangements where artists and masters trained apprentices, and where families transmitted cultural knowledge and traditions. The libraries associated with mosques and churches preserved religious texts and scholarly works that served educational and devotional purposes, while also maintaining connections to broader intellectual traditions extending beyond Sofia to encompass Islamic and Christian learning throughout the Ottoman Empire and beyond. The cultural production, including literary works, religious art, musical traditions, and various other creative activities, reflected both the diversity of Sofia's population and the influences that Ottoman rule introduced, creating a hybrid cultural environment where Bulgarian, Turkish, Greek, Armenian, and other traditions coexisted and sometimes influenced each other, despite the social and religious boundaries that separated communities. The relationship between Sofia's Christian populations and Ottoman authorities evolved over time, from initial submission following conquest to more complex patterns of accommodation, occasional resistance, and pragmatic cooperation that characterized Christian-Muslim relations throughout Ottoman Balkan territories, where substantial Christian populations lived under Muslim political authority for extended periods. The Orthodox Church hierarchy in Sofia maintained essential autonomy in managing internal religious affairs, preserving liturgical traditions, maintaining church properties, and providing leadership for the Bulgarian Christian community, creating institutional continuity that preserved Bulgarian identity despite centuries of Ottoman rule. The periodic tensions that erupted between Christian communities and Ottoman authorities, sometimes over tax burdens that Christians found oppressive, sometimes over specific incidents involving Muslim-Christian conflicts, and sometimes over accumulated resentments about subordinate status that Christian populations experienced, required both Ottoman officials and Christian leaders to exercise diplomatic skills in managing disputes before they escalated to violence that would threaten stability. The relative success that Ottoman governance achieved in maintaining order in Sofia, despite ruling over populations with potentially conflicting interests and resentments, demonstrated both sophistication of Turkish administrative systems and the pragmatic accommodations that diverse populations made when alternatives to cooperation appeared worse than accepting the status quo, however imperfect. 1390 through 1400 witnessed Sofia's consolidation as a major Ottoman provincial center, whose importance continued growing as Turkish administration invested in developing the city's infrastructure. As commercial activities expanded, benefiting from security and integration into imperial networks, and as Sofia's strategic position made it an increasingly crucial base for Ottoman military operations targeting territories beyond the Balkans that still resisted Turkish expansion. The administrative reforms that Ottoman authorities implemented during this decade standardized governance procedures, systematized tax collection, regularized judicial processes, and generally created more efficient bureaucratic mechanisms that enabled Sofia's provincial government to manage extensive territories while maintaining effective control and generating substantial revenues for the imperial treasury. The military infrastructure that Ottoman forces developed in and around Sofia, including strengthened fortifications, expanded garrison facilities, supply depots, and various other installations necessary for supporting military operations, reflected the city's role as a major base for campaigns that would project Ottoman power northward toward Hungary and westward toward Bosnia and Croatia, where Turkish expansion would continue through the 15th century. The economic prosperity that Sofia achieved during the late 14th and early 15th centuries, benefiting from commercial growth and from Ottoman investments in infrastructure and security, made the city one of the wealthiest Ottoman provincial centers in European territories, and created conditions where diverse populations could achieve material well-being despite the political subordination and religious discrimination that Ottoman rule imposed on Christian subjects. The commercial networks connecting Sofia to Constantinople, to other Balkan cities, to Anatolian markets, and to more distant trading centers, including Venice, Dubrovnik, and various Central European cities, channeled goods whose volume and value generated customs revenues and commercial profits that enriched both the Ottoman treasury and private merchants who participated in this trade. The manufacturing activities that developed in Sofia, producing goods ranging from everyday items serving local consumption to higher quality products suitable for export to distant markets, created employment for a substantial urban population, including both Muslim and Christian artisans whose skilled labor contributed to Sofia's economic productivity. The agricultural production from fertile valleys surrounding Sofia, marketed through the city and supporting both urban consumption and export trade, created economic interdependencies between city and countryside that sustained prosperity while also creating vulnerabilities when warfare or natural disasters disrupted agricultural production. The cultural synthesis that emerged in Sofia over time, reflecting centuries of interaction between Bulgarian, Turkish, Greek, Armenian, Jewish, and other communities whose coexistence in shared urban space created opportunities for cultural exchange despite religious and social boundaries separating populations, produced distinctive hybrid culture that was neither purely Bulgarian nor purely Turkish, but rather reflected the complex historical experience of multi-ethnic urban society under Ottoman governance. The linguistic borrowings that occurred as the Bulgarian language absorbed Turkish vocabulary, and as Turkish was spoken in Sofia, incorporated Bulgarian words and expressions, demonstrating everyday cultural interactions that formal social boundaries could not prevent, creating linguistic evidence of cultural exchange that occurred despite religious divisions. The culinary traditions that developed in Ottoman Sofia, incorporating elements from diverse cultural backgrounds and creating distinctive local dishes reflecting available ingredients and cooking techniques drawn from different traditions, illustrated how cultural synthesis could occur in practical daily life aspects, even when more formal cultural and religious boundaries remained rigid. The architectural forms that evolved, combining Ottoman, Byzantine, and local Balkan building traditions in ways that created a distinctive Sofia aesthetic, demonstrated how material culture could reflect complex historical experiences and diverse influences that shaped urban development. The historical memory of Sofia's conquest in 1385 acquired different meanings for different communities across subsequent centuries, with Bulgarian national narratives emphasizing the tragedy of losing independence and the beginning of centuries of Ottoman domination, while Turkish historical traditions celebrated the conquest as demonstration of Ottoman military prowess and a step toward creating the extensive empire that would make Ottomans one of history's great powers. The Bulgarian folk songs and literary works that commemorated Sofia's conquest, transmitted orally across generations before being recorded in later centuries, preserved the cultural memory of independent Bulgarian statehood and of resistance to Ottoman conquest, creating narratives that would sustain Bulgarian national consciousness through centuries of Turkish rule, and that would eventually inspire 19th century independence movements seeking to restore Bulgarian sovereignty. The Ottoman chronicles that describe Sofia's conquest emphasize Sultan Murad's military genius and the inevitability of Ottoman victory, incorporating the campaign into triumphalist narratives about Turkish expansion that legitimized Ottoman rule while minimizing Bulgarian resistance or suffering that the conquest inflicted. The comparative analysis of Sofia's conquest and integration into the Ottoman Empire alongside similar processes in other Balkan cities reveals both common patterns that characterized Ottoman expansion and unique features that distinguish Sofia's experience from other urban centers' trajectories under Turkish rule. The relatively rapid Ottoman conquest of Sofia, following a brief siege, contrasted with the more prolonged resistance that some other cities maintained, reflecting both Ottoman military capabilities and Sofia's vulnerable strategic position that made effective long-term defense unrealistic. The generous terms that Sofia's population received following conquest, including protections for Christian religious practices and property rights, resembled patterns that Ottoman authorities employed throughout the Balkans as a means of encouraging peaceful submissions while minimizing resistance and the costs of conquest. The successful economic integration of Sofia into Ottoman commercial and administrative systems, creating prosperity that made Ottoman rule tolerable if not welcome for substantial portions of the population. demonstrated patterns that would be repeated in many other Balkan cities whose economic development benefited from Ottoman security and imperial integration despite the political subordination and religious discrimination that Turkish rule imposed. The legacy of Sofia's Ottoman period, extending from the conquest in 1385 until Bulgarian independence was restored in the late 19th century, profoundly shaped the city's development and created enduring influences that remained visible in Sofia's architecture, demographics, culture, and even political dynamics long after Ottoman rule ended. The architectural heritage from the Ottoman period, including mosques, baths, markets, and various other buildings, represented tangible reminders of Turkish rule that the newly independent Bulgarian state would struggle to integrate into national narratives emphasizing Christian Bulgarian identity, while also recognizing the practical value of these structures as historical monuments and as functional buildings serving contemporary needs. The demographic legacies, including Turkish Muslim populations that remained in Sofia after Bulgarian independence, and the complex ethnic and religious diversity that centuries of Ottoman rule had created, required post-independence Bulgarian governments to manage a multi-ethnic society despite nationalist ideologies emphasizing the ethnic Bulgarian character of the restored independent state. The cultural influences that the Ottoman period left, including linguistic borrowings, culinary traditions, musical forms, and various other elements that had become integrated into Bulgarian culture during centuries of Turkish rule, created a hybrid cultural heritage that challenged simple nationalist narratives, while also demonstrating how cultures evolve through historical interactions even under conditions of political subordination and foreign domination. The lessons that Sofia's conquest and Ottoman integration offer for understanding medieval warfare, imperial expansion, and the dynamics of conquest and accommodation between conquerors and conquered populations encompass insights about how military power translates into political control, how effective administration can transform hostile populations into relatively compliant subjects, and how economic prosperity and religious tolerance can reduce resistance to foreign rule even when cultural and religious differences create potential sources of conflict. The Ottoman strategic approach, combining military force with diplomatic pressure and generous terms for submission, demonstrated in Sofia's conquest and many other Ottoman campaigns, proved remarkably effective at expanding Turkish control while minimizing costs and creating conditions for relatively stable governance following conquest. The administrative sophistication that enabled Ottoman authorities to govern diverse multi-ethnic and multi-religious populations across vast territories without requiring impossible levels of military occupation or constant repression demonstrated organizational capabilities that distinguish successful empires from conquest states that could seize territories but could not effectively govern them. The cultural synthesis that emerged in cities like Sofia, where diverse populations coexisted under Ottoman rule for centuries, creating hybrid cultures that were richer and more complex than either original culture alone, demonstrated how historical interactions, even under conditions of conquest, could produce creative cultural developments alongside the suffering and injustice that foreign domination inevitably imposed. The historical significance of Sofia's conquest in 1385 extends beyond the immediate military and political events to encompass the broader transformation of Balkan political geography that Ottoman expansion accomplished during the late 14th century, fundamentally altering the region's power relationships and creating patterns of Ottoman dominance that would persist for nearly 5 centuries until the dissolution of Turkish control over Balkan territories during the 19th and early 20th centuries. The conquest represented a crucial step in Ottoman consolidation of control over the Central Balkan interior, filling the strategic space between earlier Ottoman conquests in Thrace and Macedonia, and enabling more effective projection of Turkish military power throughout remaining Balkan territories that had not yet been fully subordinated to Ottoman authority. The establishment of Sofia as a major Ottoman provincial center created an administrative and military infrastructure that would support Turkish governance of extensive territories, and that would serve as a base for subsequent Ottoman campaigns extending Ottoman control northward toward Hungary and westward toward the Adriatic coast, where Bosnian and Croatian territories would eventually be brought under Turkish suzerainty or direct administration. The military dimensions of Sofia's conquests demonstrated Ottoman siege warfare capabilities that had been refined through decades of continuous campaigning against diverse opponents, and that combined traditional medieval siege techniques with innovations that Ottoman engineers and commanders had developed through practical experience. The relatively brief duration of active siege operations from encirclement to conquest, probably spanning only several weeks rather than the months or years that some medieval sieges required, demonstrated Ottoman efficiency in conducting siege warfare and in bringing overwhelming force to bear against defensive positions that could not be adequately reinforced or relieved. The tactical sophistication that Ottoman forces displayed in combining bombardment, mining operations, and coordinated assault through created breaches illustrated the professional military capabilities that made Ottoman armies exceptionally effective throughout this period, and that enabled Turkish expansion to achieve remarkable success against diverse opponents across multiple theaters of operation extending from Europe through Anatolia to the Middle East. The administrative legacy of Sofia's integration into Ottoman provincial systems influenced how the city was governed not only during the Ottoman period but also in some respects after Bulgarian independence was restored. As administrative practices, legal concepts, and governance structures that Ottoman rule established sometimes persisted or influenced successor institutions despite political rhetoric emphasizing a complete break with the Ottoman past. The Ottoman provincial administrative systems that managed Sofia and surrounding territories for nearly 5 centuries created institutional experiences and practices that could not be entirely erased. When political authority changed hands, as populations had learned to navigate Ottoman bureaucratic procedures and as administrative personnel who served Ottoman authorities often continued in similar capacities under new Bulgarian government that required experienced administrators even if their Ottoman training and experience created ideological complications. The legal concepts and judicial procedures that Ottoman governance had introduced, combining Islamic law with customary practices and with pragmatic adaptations to local circumstances, influenced legal thinking and practices that persisted beyond the Ottoman period, even as the independent Bulgarian state sought to create legal systems emphasizing European rather than Ottoman influences. The historiographical debates about Sofia's conquest and Ottoman period have evolved considerably across the centuries, separating the 14th century events from contemporary historical scholarship, reflecting changing historical methodologies, shifting political contexts in which historians worked, and varying national and ideological perspectives that shaped how different scholars interpreted the events and assessed their significance. The Ottoman chronicles composed during the empire's existence celebrated Sofia's conquest as a demonstration of Sultan Murad's military genius and divine favor supporting Ottoman expansion, typically minimizing siege duration and Bulgarian resistance to emphasize the inevitability of Turkish victory. The Bulgarian national histories, composed during the 19th and 20th centuries after independence was restored, portrayed Sofia's conquest as a catastrophic national tragedy marking the beginning of centuries of Ottoman oppression, emphasizing Bulgarian suffering and resistance while portraying Ottoman rule as a dark period of foreign domination that suppressed Bulgarian culture and development. The modern academic historians studying Sofia's Ottoman period with access to more diverse sources, including both Ottoman administrative records and Bulgarian cultural productions, have developed more nuanced interpretations acknowledging both the genuine hardships and discrimination that Ottoman rule imposed on Christian Bulgarian populations, and the economic development and administrative sophistication that Turkish governance sometimes provided, creating more complex historical understanding that resists simple narratives of either Ottoman enlightened rule or pure oppression. The archaeological evidence from Sofia's Ottoman period, including physical remains of buildings, artifacts from daily life, and structural evidence of urban development patterns, provides material evidence complementing documentary sources and helping reconstruct how the city developed and how populations lived under Turkish rule. The mosques, baths, markets, and other Ottoman buildings that survived into the modern period despite wars, urban development, and sometimes deliberate destruction of Ottoman heritage provide tangible connections to Sofia's past and create preservation challenges for contemporary Bulgarian society, balancing respect for architectural heritage with nationalist sensibilities emphasizing Christian Bulgarian identity. The archaeological excavations conducted in Sofia during the 20th and 21st centuries have uncovered material evidence of Ottoman period, including household artifacts, commercial items, religious objects, and structural remains that reveal details about daily life and urban development that written sources alone could not provide, creating richer understanding of how diverse populations lived in Ottoman Sofia and how the city functioned as administrative, military, and commercial center. The contemporary relevance of understanding Sofia's Ottoman period and the broader patterns of Ottoman expansion that the city's conquest exemplified extends beyond historical interest to encompass ongoing questions about cultural identity, religious tolerance, ethnic diversity, and historical memory that continue affecting Balkan politics and societies long after Ottoman rule ended. The multicultural heritage that Ottoman rule created in Sofia and throughout the Balkans, establishing patterns of religious and ethnic diversity that would persist despite nationalist movements emphasizing ethnic homogeneity, created legacies that contemporary societies continue navigating as they attempt to construct inclusive national identities that can accommodate diversity while also maintaining cultural coherence. The historical memories of Ottoman rule that different communities maintain, ranging from Bulgarian narratives emphasizing oppression to Turkish narratives emphasizing civilizing mission, create a divergent historical consciousness that can complicate contemporary relationships between Bulgarian and Turkish populations and between Balkan states and Turkey. Even though centuries have passed since Ottoman political authority ended, the human dimensions of Sofia's conquest and Ottoman integration, encompassing the experiences of the thousands of individuals whose lives were fundamentally transformed by these historical processes, deserve recognition alongside the military, political, and economic analysis that typically dominates historical narratives. The Bulgarian defenders who died attempting to preserve Sofia's independence, the civilians who suffered through siege hardships and conquest trauma, the families separated or destroyed by warfare and its consequences, and the countless ordinary people whose daily lives were permanently altered by Ottoman conquest all experienced these historical events not as abstract processes, but as concrete realities affecting every aspect of their existence. The Ottoman soldiers who died or were wounded during siege operations, the Turkish settlers who migrated to unfamiliar territories seeking opportunities while also experiencing displacement from their original homes, the administrators who attempted to govern complex multi-ethnic urban society while navigating between imperial demands and local realities, and the various other individuals involved in these historical processes all had personal stories and human experiences that broader historical narratives inevitably simplify or ignore, but that, nonetheless, represented real human dimensions of the historical events we study. The ultimate assessment of Sofia's conquest in 1385 and its consequences must acknowledge that the event represented both a significant military-political achievement for the Ottoman Empire and a traumatic loss for the Bulgarian populations who experienced conquest and subjugation to foreign rule, demonstrating how the same historical processes can have profoundly different meanings depending on perspective and on how events affected different populations. For the Ottoman Empire, Sofia's conquest represented a logical step in a systematic expansion that would create one of history's great empires, demonstrating military prowess and administrative sophistication while also serving immediate strategic purposes, including consolidating control over the Balkan interior and establishing a base for future campaigns. For Bulgarian populations, the conquest meant the end of independence in one of Bulgaria's most important cities, the beginning of centuries of Ottoman domination that would profoundly affect Bulgarian cultural development and national trajectory, and personal experiences of foreign occupation, religious discrimination, and cultural pressure despite Ottoman policies of relative religious tolerance compared to some other medieval conquests. These divergent perspectives on the same events demonstrate how historical understanding must acknowledge multiple viewpoints and must recognize that historical processes created winners and losers, whose experiences and interpretations differed fundamentally, even when describing the same factual events. The conquest of Sofia in 1385 thus stands as both an impressive demonstration of Ottoman military and administrative capabilities, and as a tragic episode in Bulgarian national history, with both perspectives capturing important aspects of historical reality that a comprehensive understanding must encompass, rather than privileging one narrative over the other based on contemporary political preferences or nationalist ideologies.